Have you ever wondered what the hardest time in history was to be born human? Not during economic crashes, world wars, or recent pandemics. We're talking about a time so brutal, so merciless, that merely surviving was almost unimaginable. When hunger was constant, diseases had no names, predators lurked everywhere, and the very climate seemed bent on erasing you. No rest, no refuge, and above all, almost no hope. Imagine opening your eyes for the first time in a world where every single day is a battle won, where fire is still a mystery and every step could be your last. This isn't a story about progress, it's a story about survival, about how the first Homo sapiens faced a world that seemed determined to wipe them out. A tale from a time that nearly ended humanity before it even had a chance to begin. Here's a rewritten version of the second part of the script. Around 74,000 years ago, Earth was a starkly different place, hostile, volatile, and bitterly cold. This era marked the last great ice age and a cataclysmic event that nearly eradicated humanity. The eruption of the Toba supervolcano in present-day Indonesia. Vast glaciers blanketed the world. From Europe to North America, colossal ice sheets spanned thousands of kilometers, trapping ocean water and lowering sea levels. This transformation affected everything: coastlines, rivers, ocean currents, and, crucially, the global climate. Lush regions turned barren. Winds were biting, snow was not seasonal. It was perpetual. In Africa, the birthplace of humanity, conditions were scarcely better. Many habitats had turned into deserts or extremely arid savannas. Rainforests shrank, and megafauna, giant beasts like ancient African elephants and enormous rhinos, migrated in search of water, disrupting the ecosystems that relied on them. But this was just the beginning. The Toba supervolcano eruption was one of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history. It expelled an enormous amount of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, creating a dense layer that blocked sunlight for years. The impact was catastrophic, a volcanic winter that plunged global temperatures by several degrees Celsius. The world seemed on the brink of collapse. Imagine waking up daily under a sky darkened by ash. The sun barely pierced the toxic clouds. Plants withered, animals perished, and with them the chances of finding food. For our ancestors, this was more than a natural disaster, it was a death sentence. But the cold and hunger weren't the only threats. In this perilous world, every creature fought desperately for survival. Predators like the cave lion, European leopard, giant hyenas, and the formidable smilodon stalked the edges of human settlements. We were not the hunters. We were the hunted. Humanity at that time was a fledgling species, vulnerable and intelligent, but lacking advanced tools, complex weapons, and articulate language as we know it today. We lived in scattered nomadic tribes, constantly on the verge of extinction. There was no agriculture, no cities, no written history, only cold, hunger, and fear. Remarkably, the human population dwindled dramatically. Some geneticists suggest that Homo sapiens may have numbered only a few thousand individuals worldwide. An evolutionary bottleneck threatened our very existence. We were on the brink of extinction. Literally, the fate of humanity hung by a thread. There may have been only about 2,000 fertile humans left on Earth. This is the story of those humans, born in the harshest of times. Neither heroes nor villains, just survivors. People like you and me, facing a relentless nature that showed no mercy, and yet somehow they endured. Here's a rewritten version of the third part of the script. To grasp how improbable human survival was during this era, consider the beings with whom we shared the planet. We were not alone, nor were we at the top of the food chain. Quite the opposite. We were newcomers, fragile, and surrounded by species that had dominated their habitats for thousands, even millions of years. In Eurasia, Neanderthals were the dominant species. They were our closest relatives, robust, intelligent, and adapted to extreme cold. Their stone tools were more advanced than ours. They buried their dead and likely had a form of symbolic language. They were the masters of the ice, having inhabited the continent for over 200,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived. In this sense, we were the intruders. Further east, in the dense, cold jungles of Asia, lived an even more mysterious species, the Denisovans. Little is known about them, but genetic analyses reveal that they were highly adapted to the harsh climate and even interbred with modern humans. Were they allies or rivals? No one knows for sure. But undoubtedly, they faced the same devastated world. Yet perhaps the most terrifying inhabitants were not other humans but the animals. This was a planet where megafauna still reigned supreme. Woolly mammoths dominated the frozen plains. With their thick fur and imposing tusks, they were both a prize and a peril for humans. Successfully hunting, one could feed a tribe for weeks, but failure meant being trampled without mercy. Nearby, woolly rhinos, as aggressive as their modern counterparts, patrolled the frozen territories, ready to kill to defend their paths. In more temperate zones, cave lions, larger than modern African lions, hunted in packs. They weren't the only dangers. Cave bears, weighing over half a ton, were formidable beasts that occupied the same caves humans sought for shelter. Conflicts often ended in bloodshed. Dire wolves and prehistoric hyenas formed powerful packs, their jaws capable of crushing bones. They lurked in the darkness, sensing fear. If a tribe grew weak or a child strayed, there was no mercy. In the skies, enormous scavenger birds waited for the slightest sign of death. In the rivers, primitive crocodiles lay in wait for anyone daring to cross. Amidst all this, Homo sapiens seemed like a biological paradox. Bare skin, no claws, no fangs, no speed. Our only weapon was ingenuity, and even that was just beginning to develop. We lived in small nomadic groups, constantly on the move. Hunting was perilous, and foraging barely sustained us. Often, we slept without fire, huddled together, shivering. Diseases were deadly. A simple wound could be fatal. Infection, a sprain, the cold itself. Any of these could kill. Women gave birth without medical aid under brutal conditions. Many died, and many infants did not survive their first winter. Yet amidst the fear and hunger, something extraordinary began to emerge. Humans started to create something more. Marks on rocks, symbols on bones, primitive rituals. A different kind of consciousness was awakening, something Neanderthals and Denisovans were only beginning to explore. The first sparks of culture. The humans of this time did more than just fight to survive. They began to remember, to leave traces, to tell their stories with symbols. This would become the seed of everything that followed. But the cost was immense. This was a world of giants and colossi, of ice and fire, where life hung by a thread. Yet a small group of Homo sapiens scattered across Africa and Asia refused to vanish. They were not heroes, they were survivors, and their legacy in some way reached us. Here's a rewritten version of the fourth part of the script. On a planet seemingly intent on their destruction, humans did more than endure. They evolved. But their evolution wasn't merely physical, it was a cognitive revolution, a transformation in cooperation and strategy. When outmatched in strength, speed, and ferocity, the only remaining option was to outthink the competition. One of the most crucial strategies was the formation of cooperative groups. While many animals acted on instinct, humans began to rely on each other not just for hunting but for survival. This collective approach made all the difference. They tended to the sick, protected the elderly, and shared food. Empathy, that intangible tool, became a vital instrument for survival. Communication, though still primitive, evolved rapidly. Through gestures, sounds, and glances, they could coordinate to encircle prey, set up ambushes, and avoid bear-occupied caves. Every small advancement in this signaling system could mean the difference between life and death. Fire, though not invented by them, became deeply symbolic. Beyond its warmth and light, fire meant security. It kept beasts at bay, allowed for cooking, making food more digestible and nutritious, and even altered human physiology. Jaws became smaller, brains grew larger. Cooking nourished not just the body, but the mind. The true revolution, however, was organized hunting. Humans began crafting more specialized tools, spearheads, stone blades, and hide scrapers. Though not perfect, these tools, combined with teamwork, enabled them to take down larger animals. Not through frontal combat, that was suicidal, but through strategy. They learned to stalk, to wait, and most importantly, to observe. They mimicked wolves hunting in packs and pursuing prey for miles until it collapsed from exhaustion. This technique, known as persistence hunting, turned human weakness, lack of speed, into an advantage. With endurance, intelligence, and patience, humans became formidable hunters. Traps also emerged. Though they may seem crude today, pitfalls, false trails, coordinated drives off cliffs, they were effective. You didn't need to overpower a mammoth, you just needed to outsmart it. You didn't need to be stronger than a lion, you just needed to avoid it. When not hunting, they foraged. Fruits, roots, insects, seeds, they learned to recognize edible plants and avoid poisonous ones. Some even began storing food for lean times, a basic concept that would later evolve into agriculture. Clothing was another critical development. The cold was as deadly as any predator. They learned to tan hides, wrap their bodies, and create protective layers. It wasn't about fashion, it was about survival. The relationship with animals also shifted. Some studies suggest that the first interactions between humans and wolves began during this period. Not immediate domestication, but a cautious alliance. Wolves benefited from human remains and humans from their keen senses. Centuries later, this relationship would give rise to the dog. But it all began here, in the harshest of times. Amidst these strategies, something even more profound emerged: storytelling. The marks on stones, symbols in caves, paintings with blood and ash, they indicated that humans didn't just want to survive, they wanted to remember and teach. A cave painting isn't just art. It's a lesson, a warning. There are bison here. One of our own died here. Danger lies ahead. It was encoded knowledge, passed down through generations. Culture emerged in the darkness like a fragile flame. At their lowest point, humanity began to create what would make them unstoppable: collective memory. In that hostile, cold, and hungry world, where any logical species would have perished, humans wove an invisible web of cooperation, language, belief, and fire. And with that, they endured. Here's a rewritten version of the fifth part of the script. The Earth is never static. Each era presents unique challenges. For our ancestors, environmental shifts were as formidable as the predators that hunted them. Survival alone wasn't enough. They had to continually adapt to a world that seemed intent on extinguishing life. Following the Toba supervolcano eruption, the planet plunged into a prolonged and harsh volcanic winter. Global temperatures plummeted. Ash-filled skies blocked sunlight, disrupting natural cycles. For years, plants struggled to grow, trees bore no fruit, and roots became scarce. The food chain crumbled in many regions. In this bleak context, famine became a constant threat. Large animals unable to find sufficient food perished. With them, the hunters who relied on their meat faced collapse. Migration was often the only option. Not a choice, but a desperate quest for survival. Yet migration offered no guarantees. The landscape was in constant flux. Rivers that once provided water vanished. Glaciers advanced, altering everything in their path. Fertile valleys could transform into frozen, uninhabitable plains overnight. Each move multiplied the dangers: new predators, new diseases, and new hostile tribes. Competition among human groups intensified. There was no unclaimed territory. Every cave, water source, or shelter could mean the difference between life and death. Relations between Homo sapiens groups grew more complex and violent. For the first time, man's greatest enemy began to be other men. Amidst this turmoil, the first signs of what we now call religion or spirituality emerged. Faced with constant death, many humans sought patterns in nature. The sky, fire, animals, and life cycles seemed to hold hidden meanings. Why did some survive while others perished? Why were some children born healthy while others died soon after? Why was hunting sometimes abundant and other times futile? The need to understand the incomprehensible gave rise to the first myths, which unified groups. Shared beliefs created identity, making groups more cohesive, stronger, and better prepared to face adversity. Meanwhile, climate changes persisted. Fluctuations between colder and slightly warmer periods caused severe ecosystem imbalances. Animals migrated aimlessly, and seasons became unpredictable. In some regions, drought was so persistent that the land turned to dust. For many humans, adaptation was impossible. They perished, leaving no trace. Entire groups vanished, swallowed by history, leaving behind no artifacts, tools, or bones, only silence. But others learned to read the signs. They moved before it was too late, found new food sources, fished, dug for roots where others saw nothing, followed migratory birds, read the sky, and listened to the earth. One of the most decisive changes was the emergence of abstract thought, linked to time. Humans began to anticipate, plan, and foresee. This temporal consciousness set them apart from other animals, allowing them to endure as the planet entered one of its harshest phases. Yet, even among survivors, not all humans were equal. Neanderthals, for instance, were better adapted to extreme cold, but their tools evolved slowly. Homo sapiens, however, were more adaptable. Their culture transformed rapidly, their thinking evolved, and their creativity made them unpredictable. It was this capacity for constant change and evolutionary adaptability that allowed a small group of Homo sapiens, against all odds, to begin emerging as the planet's dominant species. The Earth remained a wild place, but humans, fragile and defenseless, were learning to tame it. Here's a rewritten version of the sixth part of the script. The world transformed, and so did its inhabitants. One by one, the giants began to fall. For thousands of years, Neanderthals had dominated the icy landscapes of Europe. But something shifted. The climate grew even more unstable, food sources fluctuated, and competition among human groups intensified. Amid this chaos, a new type of human emerged: Homo sapiens. Initially, encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were sporadic, perhaps even peaceful. Modern DNA analysis reveals interbreeding between the two species, but contact also brought disease, competition, and likely conflict. Homo sapiens, more numerous, organized, and innovative, began occupying territories once exclusive to Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals vanished. Was it genocide? Extinction due to resource depletion? Hybridization? The causes remain debated. But around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals ceased to exist. They were the first to fall, but they wouldn't be the last in two. Asia, the Denisovans met a similar fate. Little is known about them, as their history is pieced together from fragments, a bone here, a tooth there. But their disappearance coincides with the expansion of Homo sapiens. The pattern repeated itself. Where Homo sapiens arrived, other humans vanished. But it wasn't just other human species that disappeared. The megafauna also collapsed. In North America, mastodons and giant sloths were hunted to extinction. In Australia, diprotodons, distant relatives of car-sized wombats, disappeared shortly after humans arrived. Across the globe, the arrival of Homo sapiens marked the beginning of mass extinctions of large animals. It was a lethal combination. Climate change reduced resources, and humans accelerated the process with unprecedented efficiency. Spears, fire, cooperation, these were tools no animal had faced before. Yet extinction wasn't a conscious act. There was no grand strategy, no plan, only hunger, need, and the drive to survive. No one thought about the consequences, only about the next winter. In this process, humanity also changed. They were no longer just primitive hunter-gatherers. Some communities began establishing more permanent camps, domesticating animals, collecting seeds, and experimenting with the soil. It was the dawn of something new, civilization. But even then, danger persisted. Diseases, which had spread slowly among small nomadic groups, began to propagate more rapidly. Contact with domesticated animals brought new infections. A sedentary lifestyle introduced hygiene problems and more defined territorial conflicts. And yet, Homo sapiens thrived. The key was their ability to adapt. While other species waited for the environment to improve, humans modified it. While others went extinct, humans evolved their culture. What began as survival transformed into mastery. But not without losses. Each step towards civilization left behind entire peoples. lineages that no longer exist, cultures that no one remembers. The stories of thousands of generations were lost to the wind, buried under layers of ice and earth. Yet, of all the challenges they faced, perhaps the greatest was psychological, the awareness of death, suffering, and pain. Escaping a predator is one thing. Understanding that you are dying and that no one will save you is another. Pleistocene humans developed not just tools and strategies, but a deep inner life. A nascent spirituality helped them cope with hopelessness. Perhaps, gazing at the stars, they believed someone was listening. Perhaps funeral rituals were more than farewells. They were attempts at consolation and meaning. Because if there is something harder than hunger, cold and loss, it is believing that everything was in vain. But it wasn't. Every human who fell in the snow, every tribe that went extinct, every lineage lost, was part of a chain that remained unbroken. A chain that reaches you. Here's a rewritten version of the 7th part of the script. Today we inhabit skyscrapers, traverse oceans, and venture to other planets. But it all began with a small group of humans teetering on the edge of extinction, surrounded by ice, fire, and fear. We endure not by being the strongest, but by being the most adaptable. Because we cooperate, imagine, and innovate. Because when all seemed lost, someone ignited a spark. And that spark traversed millennia to become us. Was the Pleistocene the worst time to be human? Perhaps. But without that struggle, that darkness, we would never have learned to kindle a fire. Now, as the world confronts new challenges, climate change, mass extinction, wars, the question shifts. Will we be as wise as our ancestors were resilient? Or will we allow history to repeat itself?